You know that feeling when your child says, I'm fine, but something about it feels off. Not dramatic, not obvious, just off. Maybe they suddenly hate school. Maybe their favorite snack sits untouched. Maybe the chatter you couldn't silence 2 months ago has now been replaced with one word answers and a closed door. And here's the uncomfortable truth most parents don't want to hear. Bullying rarely announces itself loudly. It sneaks in quietly and settles before you even realize something has moved in. Now, I've watched this play out more times than I can count, not just in homes, but in classrooms, playgrounds, WhatsApp groups, yes, even those seemingly innocent ones. And the biggest mistake? Parents wait for proof, something obvious, a torn shirt, a fight, a complaint. But bullying? It's not always that generous. Sometimes the only evidence you get is a version of your child that no longer feels like them. So before you march into that school ready to start a war, hold on. Because if you handle this the wrong way, you might make your child's situation worse without even realizing it. Let me show you what's really going on and what actually works. One of the hardest things for adults to understand is this: children don't stay silent about bullying because they don't trust you. They stay silent because they're trying to survive it. In their world, school isn't just a place for learning, it's a social battlefield with invisible rules. And once a child feels targeted, the first instinct isn't, I should report this, it's how do I make this stop without making it worse? Because from their perspective, speaking up can feel like pressing a button that escalates everything. There's also something deeper happening psychologically. Around preteen and teenage years, identity becomes fragile. Kids are constantly asking, without saying it out loud, where do I fit? And what happens if I lose that place? So when bullying starts, especially subtle forms like exclusion, jokes disguised as humor, or social isolation, the child doesn't just feel hurt, they start internalizing it. They begin to think, maybe something about me is the problem. That's where shame enters the picture. And shame is quiet. It doesn't scream, it hides. Many children also develop what psychologists call a form of learned helplessness over time. At first, they try small things, avoiding certain kids, changing how they act, staying quiet. But when nothing changes, their brain starts to conclude, nothing I do works anyway, so they stop trying. And here's the part parents miss most often: silence is not peace, silence is adaptation. On top of that, there's fear, very real fear, not always of physical harm, but of social consequences. Being labeled a snitch, losing the few friends they have, or making themselves an even bigger target. So when you ask, why didn't you tell me? The answer is rarely simple. It's not rebellion, it's calculation. A child is quietly weighing options with the emotional tools they have and deciding that staying quiet feels safer than speaking. And that's where things get tricky for parents, because from the outside, everything can still look normal enough until it suddenly isn't. Now, here's where most parents unintentionally lose the child they're trying to protect. They notice the change, they feel the tension, and then they go into interrogation mode: straight questions, direct pressure, sometimes even panic disguised as concern. Who is doing this to you? Why didn't you fight back? Tell me exactly what happened. And the child, they shut down even further, because to a child already carrying shame and fear, that kind of questioning doesn't feel like help, it feels like exposure. What works instead is something far less dramatic but far more effective: emotional safety before information. Children don't open up when they are pressured. They open up when they feel they won't be judged, rushed, or immediately fixed. So instead of jumping straight to the problem, the entry point is observation based curiosity. Something as simple as, you've been a bit quieter lately. School feeling different these days? No accusations, no assumptions. just space. And then comes the part most adults underestimate: silence. If you ask a question and immediately rush to fill the gap, you're teaching the child that silence is uncomfortable. But if you allow pauses, you're giving them permission to think and eventually speak. There's also timing. The best conversations rarely happen face to face under pressure. They happen in low eye contact environments, car rides, side by side walks, or moments where attention is shared elsewhere. Psychologically, this reduces emotional intensity and makes disclosure easier. When the child does start talking, even in fragments, the goal is not correction, it's validation. Not, you should have done this, but that sounds really difficult for you. That distinction matters more than most people realize because validation tells the child, my experience is real, and that is often the bridge between silence and honesty. And here's a critical mistake to avoid: don't immediately escalate to solutions. Not yet. The moment a child senses that their story will turn into instant action and confrontation, they may stop sharing details to avoid consequences they didn't ask for. Your job in this stage is not to solve the bullying, it is to rebuild trust in communication. Once that trust is strong enough, the real details begin to surface. Once a child finally opens up, this is where many parents switch from listener to general. And honestly, that shift, if done too quickly, can complicate things. Because the instinct is understandable: protect, confront, fix immediately. But bullying situations are rarely resolved by speed, they're resolved by strategy. The first mistake is rushing straight to confrontation. Marching into the school, calling out students, or escalating without structure might feel powerful in the moment, but it can quietly increase the child's vulnerability afterward. In many school environments, social systems react to exposure, sometimes in ways that make the child feel even more isolated. A more effective first step is documentation, not in an obsessive way, but in a clear, calm record of what's happening: patterns, names if known, timing, frequency. This shifts the situation from emotion to evidence. Next comes the response style you teach your child. Many kids in bullying situations fall into two extremes. Either they become passive and withdrawn, or they overreact aggressively. Neither helps long term. What you want is assertive communication, short, firm responses without emotional escalation. Something like walking away, stating boundaries clearly, and not engaging in back and forth exchanges that fuel the situation. This is where emotional regulation becomes critical. A child who can stay composed is far less predictable to a bully, and unpredictability often reduces targeting over time. Then comes school involvement. But carefully, the goal is not accusation, it's problem solving. You're engaging educators as partners, not adversaries. The most effective conversations are structured around patterns and safety, not blame. And here's something many parents miss: your child is watching how you respond more than what you say. If your reaction is panic, anger, or overreaction, they learn that the situation is uncontrollable. If your reaction is calm and structured, they start to internalize stability. But perhaps the most important shift is this: you are not trying to remove every difficult experience from their path. You are teaching them how to stand in it without breaking. That distinction is what separates temporary relief from long term resilience. If there's one uncomfortable truth about bullying, it's this: stopping it entirely isn't always possible, but reducing the likelihood and reducing its impact is very much within your control as a parent. And it doesn't start in the moment of crisis, it starts much earlier, in how a child carries themselves long before anyone targets them. Children who are consistently bullied are often not chosen randomly. Bullies tend to scan for certain signals: uncertainty in posture, hesitancy in speech, avoidance of eye contact, or a general lack of social anchoring. It's not about appearance alone. It's about perceived vulnerability. Now, that doesn't mean a child is weak. It means they haven't yet developed what psychologists call self efficacy, the internal belief that I can handle situations when they come up. And that belief is built through small, repeated wins, not lectures, not warnings, wins. Encouraging a child to take up activities where effort leads to visible progress, sports, music, structured group tasks, does something important. It quietly teaches them, my actions change outcomes. That alone shifts how they carry themselves socially. Equally important is teaching communication that is clear and grounded. Many children unknowingly communicate uncertainty through over explaining, nervous laughter, or apologizing excessively. These are small cues, but they shape how others respond to them. Teaching a child to speak in short, clear statements without over justifying themselves can subtly shift social dynamics. Then there's body language, not in a performative way, but in a natural one. Upright posture, steady walking pace, and reduced fidgeting communicate internal stability. Again, not aggression, stability. But resilience is not just individual, it's also relational. A child who has at least one or two strong, reliable friendships is significantly less likely to be persistently targeted. Social isolation is often the hidden layer beneath repeated bullying. And then there's the digital layer, something many parents underestimate. Online spaces can extend or amplify school dynamics. Teaching boundaries around group chats, screenshots, and online engagement is now part of emotional safety, not optional etiquette. But perhaps the most important thing here is this: the goal is not to create a child who looks tough. The goal is to create a child who feels internally anchored enough that external pressure doesn't easily shake them. Because bullies don't just look for weakness, they look for uncertainty. And certainty, quiet, calm certainty, is far harder to exploit. There's a point where bullying stops being something you can observe and manage at home and becomes something that needs immediate, structured intervention. And recognizing that line early can make a huge difference. One of the clearest warning signs is a sudden, sustained shift in behavior that doesn't bounce back. Not a bad day, not a mood swing, but a pattern. Withdrawal from friends, refusal to talk about school, or a consistent emotional flatness that wasn't there before. Another red flag is school avoidance that starts to feel physical. Repeated complaints of headaches, stomach discomfort, or sudden illness right before school can sometimes be the body expressing what the child cannot articulate emotionally. The brain and body are more connected than we often give them credit for in stress situations. You may also notice changes in emotional regulation. A child who becomes unusually irritable at home, overly sensitive to small comments, or quick to tears over minor issues may not be misbehaving. They may be carrying emotional overload from elsewhere and releasing it in the safest environment they have, home. Sleep disruption is another important signal. Difficulty falling asleep, frequent waking, or restless sleep patterns can reflect ongoing internal stress. In adolescence, especially, chronic stress doesn't just stay psychological, it affects physical rhythms and attention span. Then there's academic decline that doesn't match ability. When a child who was previously consistent starts dropping grades without clear academic cause, it often signals cognitive overload. A mind preoccupied with social threat has less capacity for learning and memory retention. At this stage, the focus shifts from informal support to structured support. That may include deeper engagement with school authorities, involving counselors, or in some cases, external psychological support if emotional distress is significant. It's also important to understand that prolonged bullying doesn't just affect mood, it can shape how a child interprets themselves socially over time. Their sense of safety in group environments, confidence in communication, and willingness to participate can all become affected if the situation continues unchecked. But the key principle here is timing. The earlier these patterns are recognized and addressed, the less likely they are to settle into long term emotional habits. And through all of this, the child needs one consistent message from the adult in their life: I see what's happening, I am not overwhelmed by it, and you are not handling it alone. That steady emotional presence is often the difference between a child who recovers quickly and one who carries the weight for years. Bullying isn't always loud, and it isn't always visible. Most of the time, it starts quietly through behavior changes, silence, and small emotional shifts that are easy to miss if you're only looking for obvious signs. What matters most is not panic, but pattern recognition, not confrontation, but communication, and not trying to control every situation, but building a child who feels stable enough to navigate it. Because at the end of the day, children don't need perfect protection, they need consistent emotional grounding. Someone who notices, listens, and responds with clarity instead of chaos. If you've ever had to deal with something like this, share your experience in the comments. These situations often look different in real life than they do on paper, and your story might help someone else see what they've been missing. I do go through the comments and respond when I can. And if this helped you in any way, like, share, and subscribe. There's more on understanding children's behavior coming soon, and it only gets more real from here.